Thank you to our Patreon members for supporting the channel. Once upon a time, there was a family of beavers. Not your normal beavers. These beavers were big. They were intelligent. These were Timberborn beavers. Strong as grizzly bears and smart as humans. Actually, smarter than humans, because these beavers didn't get themselves blown up like the humans did. Did I mention that all this is happening post-apocalypse? Because that's kind of important. See, most of the world is dried out and dead. But there is still water in some places, and those places tend to be where beavers live. These beavers. They're from the Folktails clan, so they like building and farming and the peaceful life. But the peaceful life takes hard work, especially in the post-apocalypse. This is Vinjin. He's the patriarch of the family. So he says, "Family, we need food, water, and logs to survive." And the family is like, "We're on it, Pop." So the son named Raidua picks a spot for the beavers to gather berries. And the son named Aradia picks a spot for the beavers to cut down trees. And the son named Talus picks a spot for a water pump, but that needs to be built with logs. And just like that, all the beavers have jobs, except for the babies. And Papa Vinjin is pleased. Before long, the water pump is finished, and Talus takes the first shift cranking the gears, which purifies the water for drinking. And boom, the colony has a second building. Papa Vinjin was happy with how the day went. The beavers don't work through the night, but there's not a whole lot for them to do otherwise. So they hang out for a bit, telling stories and dreaming about what the future will bring. And then they sleep on the ground because they don't have a house yet. It's morning, and everyone gets back to work. And the beavers start wondering if they shouldn't use their logs to build a house, like they built the water pump. But Vinjin knows what's coming, and he says no. He tells them to build another water pump, and to cut down even more trees. He tells them to build storage for the water, and storage for their berries. He tells them that before they build a house, they need to build a farmhouse. By the end of the day, there are more buildings plotted than the beavers know what to do with. But they trust Vinjin, and Vinjin tells them they need to prepare. He also tells them they're going to plant carrots once the farmhouse is done. And so, it's another night sleeping on the floor for the Folktails. But soon it's morning, and the beavers are back at it again. It's still not much to look at, but the colony is coming along. The farmhouse is a surprisingly complicated building, but eventually it's finished. And Venjo, the oldest grandson of Vinjin, begins planting the carrots. With long-term food and water solutions figured out, Vinjin finally sets his mind to what kind of house he wants to build for his family. The plan is set, but that house is not going to get built tonight. The beaver family is excited about their new home, though they wonder how they're all going to be able to fit inside it. Vinjin's mind has already moved on, planning an inventor's hut where the beavers can research science, and making the carrot farm bigger. But the beavers keep working on the house, and just to Vinjin's specifications, it's built. It's a cute little house, and a good starting point for their family. But sure enough, it's too small, so they start planning a whole clump of houses so they can all live together. These beavers are hard workers, but for the colony to grow, they need to level up their engineering and architecture, and the inventor's hut will let them unlock those things. And as the day comes to a close, and only a few of the beavers get to sleep inside, Vinjin makes one more plan to build a recreational campfire right in the heart of the village. The beavers have a lot to be proud of, and a lot to be excited about. These beavers have been chopping down a lot of trees, and to make sure they don't run out of their lumber source, they need to build a forester's cabin. The problem is this building needs to be unlocked with science points, and it's built with planks, an advanced resource. To make planks, they need a lumber mill, and to run a lumber mill, they need power, and to get power, they need a water wheel. It's a big project for the beavers, but it'll be worth it. Oh, and the houses are finished, so for the first time, the whole family gets to sleep indoors and on beds. Beaver happiness is at an all-time high, but Vinjin knows what's still coming. He tells his family to build a dam that will block the water flow on their river. He even tells them to hold off on the water wheel. Not everyone agrees with this move, but they respect Vinjin and do what he says. And by the end of the day, the first piece of the dam is finished. Vinjin's design contains the water, but leaves a gap so there's no flooding. The colony is making a lot of progress, and there's a lot to keep up with. But the campfire is ready, and the beavers absolutely love it. Every day brings exciting new challenges, and priority number one is Vinjin's dam. Vinjin seems to think hard times are ahead. Things seem pretty good to the beavers now, except that they're running out of trees to cut down. But Vinjin is in charge, and the Timberborns aren't much for democracy, so the dam gets built first. But also, the first batch of carrots are beginning to sprout up, and that will make these beavers very happy. With food to eat, good social time, and a nearly finished dam, things are sure looking good for these beavers. So begins the harvest of the carrots, which is celebrated alongside the completion of the dam, which means the beavers can get back to the water wheel and expanding their science center and adding more houses so the family can continue to grow. Unfortunately, the beavers are almost out of trees, but the lumber mill is finished, which means they're one step closer to replanting the forest. And by nightfall, Vinjin is prepared to commit to that plan. And it looks like adding houses worked. That was fast. Beaver ingenuity is on the rise, but beaver resources are getting scarce. So they expand to chop down every tree they can find. With a few more planks, they can build the forester's cabin, but even then, they have to wait for the planted trees to grow. But just like the carrot farm, the tree farm is the only way this colony will thrive and grow. As the day comes to a close, the cabin is finished, ready to begin planting at first light. Vinjin plots out where he wants the tree farm to be, and the next day the beavers get to work. Yes, these pine seedlings are somehow already taller than a beaver, but they have a long way to grow. The trees, like the baby beavers, will just have to wait. Vinjin's plan for a multi-level, terraced housing center is coming along, and these beavers are always building something. Unfortunately, construction is being bottlenecked by the lack of logs, but that doesn't stop them from planning their next projects, and the family has already accomplished a lot in such a short amount of time. The beavers awake to some startling news. Vinjin says a drought is coming. The beavers have 3 days to make sure they're ready. Vinjin has worked hard to prepare his family for this inevitable situation. He has seen his share of droughts, but thanks to the dam, their farms and fields should stay green and growing, even if the surrounding area dries out. In the post-apocalypse, every day matters and could decide whether you survive or die, but even more so when a drought is coming. These beavers couldn't sit around and wait. Now is the time for action. Every beaver was doing their part to prepare, but none of them were prepared for what tomorrow would bring. Vinjin had died. The fearless leader of the family, who had brought his colony so far, passed peacefully in his sleep just 1 day before the drought began. It was a somber day for the beavers, but they couldn't even stop to mourn properly because the drought was coming so soon. And ultimately they all knew that's what Vinjin would have wanted. Everyone got one more good night's rest before the drought began. In the morning, just as Vinjin had predicted, the river dried up, and the land with it. Except for the land where the Timberborn beavers had built, where Vinjin's dam was working exactly as intended. The water had been held back, the land was still green and growing, and the beavers were able to continue their work mostly undisturbed. The pumps were turned off to conserve the river water, and as long as it didn't all evaporate before the end of the drought, the colony was going to be alright. The beavers planted a small field of sunflowers, Vinjin's favorite, to honor the leader who had prepared them so well. For now, it was the only memorial they could make. If only Vinjin could have been there to see that the preparations he made paid off. Day 2 of the drought, and there was no denying that the water level was decreasing, but the dam was doing its job, and the beavers only had to survive a couple more days of drought. The tree farm was expanded to include oak trees, a potato field was planted next to the carrots, and the beavers even had time to break down a natural barrier along the river. This meant that when the drought ended, the river would also flow into this dried out canyon, potentially providing water to new beaver families downstream. All in all, another successful day for the beaver colony, despite the ongoing drought. On the last day of this dry season, the beavers felt an immense sense of optimism and appreciation for all that Vinjin had helped them do. The water level had dropped more, but there was still plenty to see them through. The young beavers played while the grown-ups continued their work. In a few short hours, the dried-up river would flow again, and the danger of the drought would be behind them. To think back to where this family was just days ago, seeing all they had accomplished in this short time, the Timberborn sat around their campfire, retelling the story of Vinjin's dam that saved their home. And the next morning, just as Vinjin had predicted, the water returned, bringing the dried ground back to life. The family was safe, the village had survived, and these Timberborn beavers had a bright future ahead of them. So the family of Folktales survived the drought, thanks to the dam that Vinjin had them build, even though Vinjin died before he got to see the results of his leadership. And now the question on everyone's mind was, who is going to be our leader now? But that turned out to be a complicated decision. The obvious choice would be one of Vinjin's sons, Raidua, Aradia, or Talus. But many of the beavers thought Vinjin's oldest grandson, Venjo, should lead, since Vinjin had mentored him. This wouldn't have been an issue, except that Talus publicly endorsed Venjo, validating him as a potential leader. To avoid division, the leaders agreed to work together until the next dry season, then let the village vote for their next leader. With the decision pushed back, the beavers carried on building their society. And remember this canyon? It's a flowing river now that the Folktales unblocked the entrance, hoping to water more earth and maybe help beavers downstream. Little did they know, that's exactly what happened. Not far from the colony, another family of beavers had moved onto the new river, right next to a waterfall. This family was not from the Folktails clan though. These were Iron Teeth beavers, an aggressive and even militant clan. The Folktails liked farming in peace and quiet. The Iron Teeth liked the clanging of heavy industry and dominating the land. This family was led by a beaver named Quiggamid. Anxious for success, the beavers got to work chopping trees, gathering berries, and building a water pump. The Iron Teeth focused more on berry gathering than the Folktails did, and for a specific reason. The Iron Teeth have a very specific method of reproduction, and berries play an important part. So if the family wanted to have more babies, they needed lots of berries. Of course, the first night there were no houses to sleep in, but these beavers were used to harsh living. In fact, there wouldn't be houses in this colony for a long time. But the next morning, the beavers got back to work, building the water storage as well as Iron Teeth breeding pods. That's right, the beavers have been harvesting berries to combine with water in order to grow their offspring in these pods. It might seem odd, but that was the Iron Teeth way, so the colony was already planning for exponential growth. In the morning, the second pod was finished, and you could even see the baby beavers inside, which is kinda gross. Meanwhile, things were moving slowly with the Folktails. They were short on logs and waiting for their tree farm to produce what they needed. But this did give Venjo time to plan how to prove himself and gain the colony's trust. For now, the beavers focused on farming, including the first harvest of Vengeance sunflower seeds, which became a super popular snack for our Folktails. The family was also growing steadily, though there had been recent losses of some of the matriarchs of the family. And then the pine trees began sprouting up, which meant new construction was possible again. And Raidua pushed for a second farmhouse to better keep up with the crops. Venjo went along with Raidua's initiative, but he had his own plans for the new logs. He knew he needed to do something big to prove he could lead. The next morning, his plan went public. Venjo wanted to use the new stockpile of logs to move past the tiny water tanks and build a medium tank, which would require a huge investment of science, planks, and gears, which meant they first needed a gear workshop. This was a big commitment, but the family was excited about it, so the project went ahead. This could make or break Venjo's chances of becoming the family leader. The Iron Teeth had built the farmhouse and planted a field of kohlrabis, a staple for the clan. The family would be eating well once this crop was grown. These beavers had also begun investing in science, and of course they had to keep tabs on their growing babies. Despite not having houses, the Iron Teeth were doing pretty good. They had a picturesque location on the river, and their village was growing quickly. But they didn't seem concerned about the possibility of a drought. Perhaps these Iron Teeth didn't know what the Folktails knew, and that could prove to be devastating for Quiggamid and his family. The new babies were well on their way, but as the beavers began planning for industry, they realized a problem. Setting up water wheels for power was going to be way too complicated on either side of their peninsula. They did, however, have a design for a power wheel, which converted beaver power into electricity. The Iron Teeth weren't afraid of hard labor though, so they laid out the plan and got to building. The kohlrabis had also started sprouting, and the first new Iron Teeth baby popped out of the breeding pod. Welcome to the world, little buddy. There was a buzz in the air at the Folktails village. They had begun grilling potatoes, another one of Raidua's ideas, and that went over very well. Meanwhile, the gear workshop was still under construction, and Venjo called for another lumber mill to speed up the process. That would make things faster, but adding new construction to finish old construction is the kind of thing that raises eyebrows. If Venjo's plan didn't pay off, he could kiss his leadership dreams goodbye. And all these changes left the family with lots to gossip about after work hours. The next day, the new lumber mill was finished. Raidua countered by plotting a field of wheat to further diversify food production. Venjo had to admit that food did seem like a quicker way to a beaver's heart. But he wasn't just trying to win votes, he really was thinking about his family's future. He wanted what was best for the colony. He just had to prove that to everyone. But the quick wins were working for Raidua, so the next day, Venjo had the beavers build a couple of showers, which earned him some favor while he worked on his bigger plans. And as the colony expanded, Venjo had begun to notice a trend. The woodcutters carried their logs to the pile. The water pumpers carried their water to the tanks. The lumber mill beavers carried their planks to storage and then had to collect their own logs to continue their work. Even the grill worker had to carry his own potatoes up to his shop. The beavers were spending so much of their time just hauling things around in order to do their jobs. And Venjo thought they could improve on that. Back at the Iron Teeth village, the beavers were reaping a huge harvest of kohlrabi, and they had finished their lumber mill and power wheel. And one strong beaver named Ridja Mayar volunteered to work the wheel first. Producing planks meant the beavers could build stairs to reach more logs, which was one thing Quiggamid worried the colony was running low on. The other thing was berries. Until the next harvest, it would be a challenge to keep running the breeding pods. But overall, the Iron Teeth colony was making strong progress, even though everyone was still sleeping in the dirt. They built a forester's cabin and began planting a tree farm. And just in time, too, because these beavers were running out of trees to chop down. A new farmhouse went up to help with the harvest, and more baby beavers were popping out. The only thing these beavers seemed to be forgetting was the dry season. But that was all about to change. Venjo found his solution, a hauling post which would employ specialized moving beavers. And in another eyebrow-raising move, Venjo paused construction of the water tank to complete the hauling post first. Hauling your own goods had always been normal for the Beavers, so they weren't entirely sold on Venjo's new system. But the showers were good, so they decided to go along with Venjo for now. And when the hauling post was done, they saw the proof of Venjo's genius. Haulers with special carry harnesses, whose whole job was moving goods around, began restocking workstations, leaving the working beavers more time to focus on production. They restocked logs, they moved food and water supplies into storage, and beaver production was skyrocketing. Venjo had pulled out a major win for the colony. This would definitely earn him more votes. And the increased production meant the medium water tank seemed more feasible too. Just like that, Venjo was a serious contender for leadership. That night though, a scouting party of Iron Teeth spotted the Folktail settlement for the first time, but remained hidden. The scouts returned to their village just as the sun was rising, but their news was quickly overshadowed. Quiggamid could tell a drought was coming, and the Iron Teeth had not prepared for this. The accusations began, but Quiggamid tried to rally the family behind a solution. If the beavers gathered enough food and stocked enough water, they had a chance to survive the dry season. And once the last baby popped, the breeding pods were paused to conserve water. Quiggamid's plan seemed good, but it didn't appease the rising frustration in his family. It looked like Quiggamid might have a revolt on his hands. But then the next day, a news story began to circulate. The scouts had reported the Folktail village upriver from them, and that got the Iron Teeth thinking. Why hadn't the Folktails warned them about the coming drought? They were basically cousins. They should have told them. And suddenly the Beavers had a new target for their anger, and Quiggamid was off the hook. It's entirely possible Quiggamid himself started this new rumor, but we'll never know for sure. As far as the family was concerned, Quiggamid was a victim like the rest of them. And in the end, it's kind of nice that the family forgave Quiggamid, because the next morning, Quiggamid had passed away. Once again, a patriarch had died just before the drought, but the Iron Teeth were determined to survive. For Quiggamid. The Folktails were also hurrying to prepare for the drought, and Venjo was feeling nervous. Productivity was up, but if the new water tank wasn't finished in time for it to be filled, then what was the point? Without the water tank, Venjo's chances of being elected would dry up like the river. There wasn't much time left before the Beavers would vote on their next chief. Sadly though, just a couple days before the dry season began, Raidua, Venjin's oldest son, passed away. On the one hand, this reinforced the idea that the family needed a younger leader. On the other hand, a radio was still in the running, and Venjo had yet to fulfill his promised water tank. But thankfully, as the last gear was delivered, the medium water tank was finished. It was massive and would hold more than enough water for the Beavers. And as the Beavers took account of all that Venjo had done, it was clear that he had a very real chance of winning the vote. Aradia was the safe choice. Venjo was the exciting choice. The colony was still split, but the vote was coming soon. Who would replace their dear Venjin? The drought started the next morning, and Venjin's dam held strong, leaving the Folktails comfortable and watered. Whereas the Iron Teeth had to watch the water disappear and their crops dry out. There was no water left to pump, their trees stopped growing, and their kohlrabis were dying on the vine. The Beavers' home became a barren waste. But their food and water supply was looking good, and would hopefully last them through the drought. With extra time on their hands, the Iron Teeth grew increasingly angry with the Folktails. They even began plotting, and as night fell, a group of Iron Teeth set out on a mission of revenge. While the Folktails slept, the Iron Teeth infiltrated their village. When they awoke in the morning, they saw the Iron Teeth had emptied all of their water tanks. They hadn't even taken the water, they just poured it out so the Folktails couldn't have it. But apparently they didn't notice the big new water tank, because that one still had plenty of water in it, so the Beavers were fine. But it had riled up the village in a big way, and on the eve of the big vote, the Folktails all wanted to know what their prospective leaders were going to do about the Iron Teeth. Aradia called for calm and a slow, constructive response. But Venjo agreed with the rising anger in his family, and said that under his leadership, the Folktails would strike back at the Iron Teeth for what they had tried to do. And for those Beavers who were still on the fence about Venjo, that sealed the deal. They took it to a vote, and Venjo emerged as the clear winner. There was a huge sense of relief now that the vote was over, and a strong feeling of unity now that the Folktails had a common enemy. They still had to finish out the dry season, but Venjo knew to capitalize on their anger. Retaliation, Venjo promised them. Soon. Retaliation. The Iron Teeth were ecstatic that their plot had worked. It had been a nice distraction from the depressing reality of the dry season. Thankfully, their water storage was holding, but as they gathered the last of the kohlrabis, and as they sat waiting on trees that weren't growing, the Beavers were desperate for the drought to end. Even though they were going to survive just fine, they just wanted things to get back to normal so they could get back to work. Thankfully, the next morning, The drought had ended, the water had returned, and the Iron Teeth were safe. For now. The Iron Teeth were excited to get back to work now that the dry season was over. The river was flowing, the trees were growing, the pumps were pumping, the tanks were refilling, and the breeding pods were, on. And to prevent future droughts, the Beavers needed a way to block the river. So they plotted some stairs and a wall of levees across the water. It would be a big task, but the dam would keep their land green during the next dry season. And the Iron Teeth needed it after the fiasco of that last drought. They also wondered if now was the right time to build themselves houses, which would surely boost morale and well-being. The Folktails were also rebounding from the drought and the attack by the Iron Teeth. They demolished the now empty small water tanks and were going all in on Venjo's medium tank. They also installed some shrubs to beautify the place. And speaking of construction, the Beavers added another inventor's hut and added an additional dam piece to bridge the new extension of the river. In hindsight, cutting off the river entirely would have been the perfect revenge on the Iron Teeth. But nobody thought of that. Instead, Venjo had a plan to expand the wetlands by building a second dam. And everyone was very glad they had elected Venjo as their leader, least of all because he promised they would retaliate against the Iron Teeth. The Beavers were anxious to get back at their neighbors downriver. There had been a gap in leadership in the Iron Teeth family since Quiggamid died, and since no one contested when Ridgemayar claimed the mantle, he became the new leader of the colony. The Beavers expanded by planting cassava beans and oak trees, while they continued work on the dam. The Beavers noticed that once they got across the river, they would have a fresh supply of berries and trees as well. The Iron Teeth didn't know Vengean's design for the dam. Their version was simply to build a solid wall of wood, but it would still work, and already each piece they completed notably affected the flow of the water. So it wasn't as elegant as Vengean's dam, but Ridgemayar's dam would still keep them green during the drought. And with their crops growing and more trees planted, the Iron Teeth were doing better than ever. Back at the Folktails colony, construction was underway on Venjo's new dam. By building a second dam, the Beavers would create a sort of pool section in the river, which Venjo planned to use to their advantage. Things were going very well for the family, but Venjo was always thinking about the future, and this new dam would be a good step in their continued growth as a colony. The Beavers liked Venjo's plans, though some began to wonder when he would tell them his plan to get even with the Iron Teeth. For now, Venjo wanted them to keep working. They were building another water wheel to increase their power. They pathed their way up the mountain to chop down trees there, and unfortunately, they had their first injury. A beaver named Shetsi had hurt her foot while working the lumber mill, maybe her head too, and she wouldn't be able to work again until it had healed. So Venjo commissioned medical beds, and Shetsi was soon recovering in style. Oh, and the Beavers built a second medium water tank, just in case the Iron Teeth tried that move again. Speaking of the Iron Teeth, what were the Folktails gonna do to settle the score between them? Ridgemayar's dam was still not finished, but only because the Iron Teeth were waiting on their tree farm to grow. Not ideal, but Ridgemayar wasn't too concerned. Otherwise, the colony was doing rather well, and sometimes in life you just gotta hurry up and wait. The Beavers were making the most of what they could, and there was no drought in the forecast, so as long as the trees started sprouting soon, they would be alright. And as it happened, by the next morning they had fresh trees to chop down. With logs on the pile, the Beavers continued work on the dam, and as it neared completion, an unexpected thing started happening. The solid wall dam was stopping the water alright, to the point that it was starting to overflow, flooding the ground on the opposite bank. It didn't really matter because the Beavers hadn't built anything on that side yet, though it was drowning the natural resources the Beavers had hoped to harvest. The rising water had also greenified more of the Iron Teeth land, which would open up a lot more possibilities for farming, so that seemed like a worthwhile trade-off. The Folktails weren't experiencing any flooding because they had followed Vengean's design, but Venjo's next idea did involve flooded crops. Kind of. He had the Beavers build stairs into the water and plotted a new aquatic farmhouse. This farmhouse would allow them to plant special crops in the water. They just needed to wait for logs to make it happen. And then one morning, the oak trees started sprouting up. These slow-growing trees took forever to mature, but produced a ton of logs, which meant the aquatic farmhouse was done in no time and the Beavers could get to work in the riverbed, planting cattails and spatterdock. Venjo's pool area would make the perfect aquatic farm, setting up the colony for long-term growth. Unless the Iron Teeth came back and tried to ruin it for them. What were those pesky Beavers up to anyway? Truthfully, the Iron Teeth weren't thinking about the Folktails at all. They were focused on finishing the dam so their newly flooded river wouldn't totally dry up when the next dry season hit. Whoa! Yep, that's some flooding. Wow. and since they had the logs now, Ridgemeyer decided it was time to build themselves a house. The Iron Teeth believed in communal living, so rather than make a collection of small houses like the Folktails do, these beavers are inclined to make one large house. It's a barracks, really, designed to house a large number of their family, although even then they needed a second barracks because the family had already grown so much. But the beavers who did sleep in the barracks woke up refreshed and ready for a new day, which is good because a drought was coming. The dam would keep the land from drying out though, and that would make all the difference. The Iron Teeth prepared the best they could. They added more water storage, they restocked their food warehouses, they welcomed a couple new beavers, and they finished their second barracks. But nothing would have prepared them for what happened next. The Folktails were also expanding their housing, adding additional floors and catwalks, even a rooftop terrace for entertainment. The baby beavers really enjoyed using it while the adults worked. The medical beds were allowing injured beavers to recover, and overall things were going really well for the Folktails. So well that the beavers were itching for some action, to retaliate against the Iron Teeth. It was pretty hush-hush, but Venjo had started sharing his attack plan with a few trusted beavers. The family just had to wait for the start of the drought to have the best shot at success. In the meantime, they used their log stockpile and constructed more houses, and built a grist mill by the river. The grist mill would turn wheat into flour for cooking, which Venjo knew was the fastest way to a beaver's heart, so it would at least make the beavers happy while they waited on their revenge. The mill was finished and soon began churning out flour, which was then hauled to the new bakery, and as the smell of fresh bread filled the colony, the beavers prepped for the last night before the drought, and for their attack. The Iron Teeth were feeling good and were excited to all be sleeping indoors the night before the drought began. But while the Iron Teeth slept, a squad of Folktails moved silently into their camp. In the morning, the Iron Teeth saw what had happened. The Folktails had completely destroyed their berry storage, leaving only a pile of rubble. This was a bigger blow to the Iron Teeth than the Folktail even realized, because with no other berries available, the breeding pods would shut down and the colony's growth would be stunted. This could be a big problem for the Iron Teeth. Thankfully, Ridgemeyar's dam worked great, and now that the river wasn't overflowing, a huge harvest of berries waited for them on the other side of the river, now easily accessible. So they set up some new gathering flags and got to work. The water was holding steady, most of the land was staying green, the berries were coming in and stacking up at record pace, the breeding pods were still going, and Ridgemeyar had led the family in a speedy recovery. All that was left was to get revenge on the Folktails for their retaliatory raid. So that night they went for a hike, hoping to figure it out on the way. After the Folktails had gone to bed, the Iron Teeth made their move. And in the morning, the Folktails discovered that the Iron Teeth had fully disassembled their power shaft connection, which didn't really matter because it was the dry season and the river wasn't turning the wheels much anyways, but it was still an attack and showed the Folktails that the Iron Teeth were willing to fight back. This might just turn into an all-out war. But for now, they reconnected the power, started harvesting cattails, used some of their stockpile of wood to build a catwalk system downtown, and expanded their storage capacity, since they were growing so many different crops and needed places to store them. And just like that, the Beavers had survived another dry season. And those Iron Teeth had better look out, because these Folktails were riled up and ready for action. But the Iron Teeth couldn't be bothered. They were happy with their successful dry season and their successful counter raid. And then the waters returned. The Beavers sat at their new campfire, overlooking the river, celebrating their victory, while it lasted. The leaders of the colony agreed to meet. On the one side, Venjo and the Folktails. On the other, Ridgemeyar and the Iron Teeth. The mood was tense, but Venjo broke the silence. I am Venjo of the Folktails. What are the terms of your surrender? He shouted. Ridgemeyar answered without delay. I am Ridgemeyar of the Iron Teeth. What are the terms of your surrender? You've seen our colony. You know that we outnumber you, that we are strong. But we are Iron Teeth, Ridgemeyar countered. We are born for this. We will not be defeated. Well, we will not be defeated either, Venjo shouted back. And they continued shouting for a while, but eventually they all decided to go home. Now that the Iron Teeth had successfully navigated a drought, thanks to Ridgemeyar's dam, they turned their attention to industry, because right now, one strong beaver had to manually turn a power wheel just to make planks. and the Beavers were ready to change that and take advantage of hydropower. It was a big challenge to take on, but it was an important step in advancing their colony. The Beavers also plotted a second campfire, so more of them could be part of their planning sessions against the Folktails. There was no time to bother with the Folktails now, though. A strong beaver named Rozzy was working the power wheel so the Beavers could make planks, which allowed them to build stairs down to the riverbed, and from there they plotted where the water wheels would go. And the second campfire went up quickly, which increased happiness in the family. The Beavers began construction on the water wheel, which meant swimming logs out into the river. On the plus side, the Beavers really liked getting their fur wet, so they didn't really mind the swim. Also, the crops were doing well, the tree farm was producing, and the Iron Teeth were laying a good foundation for the next generation of, breeding pod beavers. Yes, the Folktails had made threats, but the Iron Teeth had already responded to their raid, so for now they were focused on themselves. And with the water wheel built, it was time to hook up the power. They needed to use high power shafts, which required gears, so they got to work constructing a gear workshop. And they had their first injury, so they made a medical bed and hoped everything would be better in the morning. And it was, because the gears were cranking, and Rozzy was chugging away, and the second water wheel was completed, and the power shafts were getting assembled. It might have been a slow start, but the Beavers were about to have power for days. They plotted where the new lumber mill would go, and disassembled the old buildings. The river was going to give them all the power they needed. Soon the lumber mill was built and started cranking away while the Beavers removed the rubble of the destroyed buildings. They began building a new gear workshop and even welcomed some new Beavers into the family. It was true that the Folktail colony was larger and more developed than they were, but the Iron Teeth were determined to catch up quickly and beat their upriver rivals. Little did they know that that night the Folktails would make a crippling blow to the colony. The Iron Teeth awoke to find that the stairs outside their barracks, the single pathway for them to leave their homes, had been destroyed by the Folktails, leaving them stranded. Coincidentally, 2 water pumpers didn't have beds and had slept on the ground in town. And when they heard the shouts of their family, they came running and temporarily changed jobs so they could get the stairs rebuilt and free the rest of the family. They discovered the Folktails had also destroyed their new power shaft in the raid. And since there were Beavers sleeping on the ground anyway, they decided to build another barracks to ensure the Folktails couldn't cut them off again. All in all, it was a day of distracted work, and the revenge planning around the campfires quickly kicked into high gear. How would the Iron Teeth get back at the Folktails this time? But to everyone's surprise, the Iron Teeth leader Ridgemayar rejected the calls for an immediate counterstrike. He said they needed to focus on the work at home, like constructing their new barracks to avoid falling victim again, and rebuilding the power shaft and getting their industry going again, including the brand new fermenter, which cooked their cassavas into edible food. Sure, revenge would be fun, but Ridgemayar wanted to retaliate from a position of strength and not sacrifice their progress on impulsive raids. And this turned out to be great leadership by Ridgemayar, because a drought was coming. The Beavers decided to build a sort of redundancy network to their power shaft system, just in case the Folktails tried to disable them again. The Iron Teeth did what they could to prepare for the drought, under Ridgemayar's wise direction. On the plus side, the tree farm was sprouting up, including some massive oaks, and new babies were continuing to pop out of the odd and kind of gross breeding pods. And then in the morning, as the Beavers rushed off to work, the river began to dry up, and all the ground and trees began turning brown. Ridgemayar's dam pooled the water and kept their land green, but the lack of water flow brought their industry to a total standstill. But these Beavers were in a good position to wait out the dry season. Some of their farmland had unfortunately turned brown, but they had a huge supply of trees to chop down. And with the water no longer overflowing, they were even able to harvest more trees from the opposite riverbank. They had so many logs that they even needed to expand their storage. They were well stocked on food and supplies. They even welcomed new baby beavers into the family. And as more beavers grew to working age, Ridgemayar plotted a third farmhouse to utilize the available land. The Iron Teeth were tackling this dry season very well, but they couldn't know that the Folktails were making a move once again. And in the morning, the stairs were gone. Again! And not just the stairs by the barracks. The Folktails had destroyed every single set of stairs in the entire colony. They even somehow removed the natural ramps. Like, how did they do that? But since the Iron Teeth had built a ground-level barracks, they had workers on hand to quickly clear away the rubble and rebuild the stairs so everyone could get back to work. 2 raids in a row. That meant the Folktails were taking this feud pretty seriously, and it made the Iron Teeth wonder, was Ridgemayar taking it seriously? Iron Teeth Beavers are always willing to follow the leader of their family, but they're also not above ousting the leader by force if that's what it takes to preserve the family's pride. Ridgemayar asked the Beavers to just wait until the drought was over, and they reluctantly agreed to give him that time. But no more. The missing stairs to the dam gave the Beavers an interesting idea. They had spotted the Folktails dam design during their last raid and decided to try it here, but by building it on top of the current dam and continuing the dam to the mountain wall. It would be a big job, but they had the logs, and now was the time to start it, before the river flooded everything again. And so the Iron Teeth celebrated their advances in industry, their expanding farmlands, their growing family, and the beginning of a new and better dam, and enthusiastically waited for their opportunity to get revenge on the Folktails, because the next day, the waters returned. And this chapter has been all about the Iron Teeth. But what had those Folktails been up to? Well, mostly they kept up their farming and their building, and Venjo kept pushing them to expand and grow with new ideas. They built some massive new warehouses, they started a new tree farm across the river, they added new water pumps and more water storage. And, of course, they had planned out and executed 2 raids against the Iron Teeth to really put them in their place. Overall, the Folktails were doing very well. You might even say they were overconfident, thinking they had mastered the land and that the Iron Teeth were no threat to them. They were so confident, in fact, that Venjo had them begin work on their largest project yet, a monumental testament to their power and superiority, and exactly the sort of thing the Iron Teeth might target as they prepared their counterattack. Be careful, Venjo. Confidence may be your downfall. The Folktail colony was thriving. They had made a builder's hut to increase their construction speeds, and a new forester's cabin so they could plant chestnut trees, whose nuts they could grill for an additional food option. Things were going so well for the family, Venjo felt it was time for them to focus on more than just their survival, beginning with small shrines on the mountain, which the Builder Brigade quickly constructed. Venjo then plotted an enormous temple where the family could gather. This would be the biggest construction yet for the Folktails. This spiritual emphasis was new for the Beavers, but they had plenty of logs for the construction and plenty more on the way. The Beavers also built new campfires on the mountain and removed the original campfire downtown. Big changes were happening for the Folktails as their settlement continued to grow. The Iron Teeth were hoping they were on the cusp of a boom in growth as well. The Beavers were making progress on the second level of the dam, and soon the river's flow would be much more controlled. Overall, the colony was doing well, even beginning the upgrade to medium water tanks. The Iron Teeth were pushing to catch up with the Folktails, and they had a long way to go. And don't think these Beavers had forgotten about the back-to-back raids on their home. Ridgemayar had kept his word and presented them with a plan of attack, which made the family happy. But first, the Beavers needed to finish the dam, and once it was complete, the river's flooding subsided exactly as they'd hoped. The water level was now permanently raised, and the river's flow was contained again. The Iron Teeth also copied the Folktails' idea for a hauling post, which would improve their productivity, though their population needed to grow before they could commit many beavers to the job. And they continued planting and farming and chopping and building until it was time to make their move on the Folktails. The Builder Brigade had begun work on the temple. What a difference having more builders made. It was a massive job, but as the Beavers say, many paws make for light work. And eventually, there it was, the grandest building in their whole settlement. Beavers of all ages and positions would be able to gather together and chant? We don't know for sure what exactly the Timberborns' religious beliefs were, but we do know their practice involved the whole family chanting loudly. And with a rejuvenated spiritual life, the Beavers seemed to have a fresh spring in their step, because night after night, the Folktails would gather in their new temple and chant. And with that addition to the colony completed, Venjo turned his attention to their next endeavor. The 2 dams on the river were serving the colony well, but Venjo envisioned harnessing the river even more. He had the Beavers build a sort of scaffolding right where the river entered their basin. And of course, the builders got right to work. But this wasn't just a bridge across the water. In fact, this platform wasn't even the building project Venjo had in mind. It was just the platform they needed in order to build the big project. Venjo's plan was to build a huge dam with floodgates, which would turn the upper river into a giant reservoir. Another big project for the Folktails to focus on, which meant they weren't on guard. That night, while the Folktails were chanting, the Iron Teeth were on the move. In the morning, the Folktails realized what had happened, and it was actually a pretty clever raid. The Iron Teeth had completely disassembled the Folktails' hauling post. Haulers had become a core part of the Folktail society, so this would definitely slow them down quite a bit. Luckily, rebuilding it would be pretty easy, and the unemployed Beavers would soon be back to work. And this allowed Venjo to convince his family to stay focused on the new dam, rather than on planning a counterattack. Their settlement was clearly able to withstand anything those stupid Iron Teeth threw at them after all. So the Builder Brigade started making progress on the dam. Right now, construction was slow going because of a shortage of logs, but it was slowly coming along, and the beavers had plenty of farming to keep them busy, and there was always the nighttime chanting to look forward to. Meanwhile, the Iron Teeth were working on getting even more power to their industrial buildings, and trying to hurry along some new babies to keep their family growing, and they continued their slow work of building their first medium water tank. The Iron Teeth were still behind, it was true, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the colony after that successful raid. Yes, they had spotted the Folktails' giant new temple, but even though the Iron Teeth weren't especially religious themselves, they decided against attacking it, just to be safe. The Beavers were happy with their raid and happy to get back to work, though they still had another part of Rigimare's attack plan to implement when the time was right. But for now, they focused on trying to grow their family and expand their colony and be the best beavers they could be. Thankfully for the Folktails, the next morning their new tree farm started sprouting up, which meant construction on the new dam could continue and the first floodgate was finished. If only Vinjin could have seen what his family was doing now. They had come a long way from their humble beginnings, and Vinjin would have been proud of their progress. Venjo's design was for adjustable floodgates, which could be raised or lowered at will to change the flow of water. The end result would be total control of the river, though the construction was causing intermittent flooding. But the Builder Brigade would have it finished in no time, and then the Folktails would have a huge reservoir available to them. The whole colony waited excitedly for this feat of engineering to be finished. And also they did more chanting, because why not? As the dam neared completion, the builders were literally building under a waterfall, because already the river had filled behind the dam, which actually greenified a big area as well. But until the dam was finished, it was causing massive flooding. Would the Builder Brigade get the job done before the whole colony was flooded? Thankfully, not even waterfalls can stop a beaver, and the dam was completed. And the flooding wasn't that bad. Yeah, okay, it was pretty bad. What is this guy doing? But soon things settled down and the waters receded, and now the Folktails had a mega dam that would protect them from any drought. And not a moment too soon either, because a drought was on its way. And while the Folktails celebrated their success, the Iron Teeth were in trouble. The beavers were almost completely out of food. They had been so focused on the dam and growth and industry, their farming just hadn't kept up with the demand. They had planted new berry bushes, but those would take too long to produce. The Iron Teeth would need to transition all their farmland to kohlrabis just to survive. Thankfully, new land had opened up on the riverbank and was nearly cleared of trees, which might be these beavers' saving grace. They also had to shut down the breeding pods, which was a long-term loss. But at this point, short-term survival was more important, as the beavers were gobbling up the day's harvest every sundown. To make matters worse, the next day was the start of the dry season. At least the dam would keep their farmland green and their food growing. And as the water receded downriver, industry totally shut down. But industry wasn't really the beavers' concern right now anyways. They were all hungry, and the farms weren't keeping up with demand. Thankfully, the new land was cleared and new farms were plotted. But would that be enough? And fast enough? The kohlrabis were coming in, but it was never enough to get ahead of everyone's hunger. The new farms would fix that, but it would take time to build, to plant, and to grow. Thankfully, with their industry shut down by the drought, there were extra beavers available to work the farms. Every day it seemed like they were finally getting ahead of the curve, and every night the warehouses were completely emptied. This was a dire time for the Iron Teeth. You would think the lack of food would turn the beavers' focus on themselves, but no. Despite the famine, the Iron Teeth demanded that Rigimare follow through with the rest of his plan to get back at the Folktails. I suppose you could say these beavers were hangry. So that night, with bellies grumbling, the Iron Teeth launched their attack. The Folktails were definitely not expecting another raid. The drought had started, and the reservoir was holding exactly as planned. They didn't have a food problem. They even had to build a huge warehouse just for bread, and it filled up ridiculously fast. Like, holy crap, that's a lot of bread. And after the weak attack earlier, a raid from the Iron Teeth just didn't seem like something to worry about. But they shouldn't have counted out the Iron Teeth yet, because in the morning, Vinjin's dam, broken. Venjo's dam, broken. And the water was flowing away downstream, turning their farms and their land brown as it went. This was not good, but also could be fixed. Venjo called for immediate rebuilding of the dams. They had a huge reservoir of water they could release through the floodgates, but it would all wash away again unless the dams were fixed. Thankfully, the Builder Brigade was on it and made quick work of the repairs. At Venjo's command, the floodgates were opened and water came pouring through, replenishing the land as it refilled the river. The Iron Teeth had hit them hard, but thanks to advances pushed by Venjo, they recovered quickly. The floodgates were a thing of beauty, and soon the water had completely returned to normal, at which point the floodgates were raised again. It had cost them much of the reservoir, but then again, that's what it was built for. And now the beavers really had something to chant about. They had fully recovered from a near catastrophic event brought on by the Iron Teeth. And after that stress, they could finally relax. And plan their revenge, of course. The Beavers had been tested and had come through victorious. And that night, they chanted like they had never chanted before. Those pesky Iron Teeth hadn't seen the last of the Folktails yet. The Iron Teeth were ecstatic about their successful raid. Of course, they were also hungry, which was causing them to work slower, which only made things worse. Their only hope was to hold out for the new field to finish growing, which was easier said than done with so many hungry beavers. That night, the sound of beaver snores was drowned out by the sound of beaver tummy grumblings. The colony was approaching a breaking point. They would start losing beavers soon if their food situation didn't turn around. But then, the new kohlrabi started sprouting, a fresh crop ready to be harvested. The farmers began pulling them up and the haulers began moving them back to storage. The beavers weren't worried about replanting the field, they were only focused on preventing starvation. And as the day came to a close, it actually looked like the Iron Teeth were gonna be okay. The beavers didn't chant, but they were thankful. And as the Iron Teeth went to bed and waited for the waters to return the next day, they wondered, with survival itself being challenging enough, was the fighting really worth it? Was this feud with the Folktails really necessary? Would it make sense to pursue peace and the mutual well-being of all beaver kind? To work together in harmony, to combine their strength and find true stability? Nah, forget those guys. Iron Teeth for life. After barely surviving the famine, the Iron Teeth decided to make some changes. They had finally harvested enough kohlrabis to feed everyone, thanks to the added farm on the river. But the beavers wanted to make sure they would never go hungry again. They also had a plan to take their colony to the next level and get ahead of the Folktails. With metal. The Folktails didn't appear to be pursuing metal, and the Iron Teeth wanted to beat them to it. With a bit of building up the mountain, the Iron Teeth would have access to the huge source of metal right next to their colony. Metal would open up all kinds of new advancements. This could be how the Iron Teeth get their advantage. The Iron Teeth have been trailing behind the Folktails this entire feud, but this could change all of that. The Folktails were doing wonderfully, except for the occasional flooding. The reservoir and floodgates were working exactly as intended. They were just a bit difficult to control sometimes. But the river would always sort itself out with no real harm done. As magnificent as the floodgate dam was, Venjo drafted an addition to the design that might help with the flooding. The Beavers had made other additions as well. A chestnut tree farm for nuts, and a maple tree farm for syrup. And of course, the social and spiritual retreat in the hills above their settlement was filling everyone with happiness. The Beavers were also making quite a winding network in their downtown area. Their colony was definitely larger and more developed than the Iron Teeth, and you would think their new spiritual emphasis would make them desire peace with their Timberborn cousins downriver. But no. After the attack on their dams, the Folktails were more eager than ever to put the Iron Teeth in their place. The Iron Teeth were pretty eager as well, eager to get up the mountain and begin harvesting scrap metal. 2 beavers volunteered for the job, one named Equinus and another named Vonjon. Yes, not Vinjan, Vonjon. And they began disassembling this dilapidated old human building and stripping away the metal beams for their own use. Back down by the river, the last of the kohlrabis were being harvested, and the beavers were converting the farm into a cornfield. Corn was going to be an important part of making sure the beavers never went hungry again. The extra kohlrabis had saved the family from extinction, but the Iron Teeth had bigger plans in mind. You could feel the excitement in the settlement as the beavers went to work. The scrap metal they were gathering would have so many uses, and it was going to take a long time to harvest it all. The beavers had a plan to future-proof their food supply, and the first baby beavers since the famine came popping out of the breeding pods, filling the family with hope. Maybe this was their moment to get ahead of the Folktails. And as more and more scrap metal was hauled away into storage, Ridgemayar plotted a smelter which would turn the scrap metal into usable beams. It seemed the Iron Teeth had returned with a vengeance after the last dry season. But little did they know, vengeance is what was coming for them. The chestnut trees were chestnutting, which meant the gatherers were hard at work, gathering, so the grill could get to grilling. Wow, that grill is really getting buried in the downtown expansion, isn't it? And the ramp/retaining wall was going up, and the downtown network was coming together. From the outside looking in, you wouldn't think these beavers had any reason to be bothered by the Iron Teeth downriver. But oh, they were. And they had a plan for revenge that would make the Iron Teeth pay for destroying their dams. The Folktails had been saved by their reservoir, but they were going to make sure the Iron Teeth weren't so lucky. But first, the Beavers continued with their building projects. At the moment, things were moving pretty slow because of a shortage of logs. They had built a new tree farm across the river, but it just wasn't ready yet. So the Beavers were cutting down trees wherever they could, but it was barely enough to keep the builders working, let alone build up a stockpile. And while slow progress is still progress, it wasn't good enough for Venjo. He called for a massive overhaul of part of downtown, which honestly left the Beavers feeling a little uneasy. But I guess Venjo had never let them down before, right? A few of the village elders shared their concerns with Venjo, but mostly the Beavers agreed to continue their work. And soon the ramp was finished, which presented them with opportunities to chop down new trees above the reservoir, which could be a big help to the family. This was also the first time these Beavers had been up close to one of the ancient metal ruins. Wow, they thought. Those humans knew how to build some crazy structures, but that was about the extent of their thoughts on it, as none of them saw the value of the metal, and Venjo had his mind on other things, not least of which was their planned counter-raid on the Iron Teeth. The Iron Teeth were certainly not expecting a raid. They had been expanding their power input, which they would need to run the smelter once it was finished. They had even begun plans to expand across the river. Perhaps they were just too happy with their recent progress, but the Iron Teeth weren't thinking at all about the Folktails and what they might be up to, and that would prove to be a big mistake. That night, the Folktails raided the Iron Teeth settlement and took their revenge. The Iron Teeth had broken the Folktails dam. The Folktails responded in kind, but this time, the damage wouldn't be so easily fixed. This time, the dam was truly broken, both levels. The excess water washed downstream as the river returned to its normal level. Unfortunately, that meant farmland that had been greenified by the raised water was now dried out and dying once again. Plans were immediately made to rebuild the dam, but could it be completed before too much was lost? Unfortunately, some of the new crops were especially fragile and died almost immediately, but rebuilding the dam was going to take time. The Folktails hit the Iron Teeth in a big way and really put a damper on their recent excitement. Of course, the success of their raid gave the Folktails a spring in their step as they went back to work, though a spring in their step wouldn't make trees grow faster, and these Beavers were trying to get logs wherever they could. Thankfully though, just then the oak trees started popping up, and that would help them finish some projects, like relocating their lumber piles, and finishing the downtown changes, and building the biggest house the Beavers had made yet. The tiered housing design had really turned out pretty neat, though they were running out of room to keep adding on. And the maple trees had begun syruping, which meant it was time to build a tapper's hut. The tapper would harvest the syrup, and the baker would use it to make maple pastries, a surefire favorite for the family. A successful raid and a new tasty treat on the way? What else could these Beavers even need? Oh please, like Venjo would let them slow down. So as the first maple syrup was coming in and being delivered to the bakery, and as the smell of maple pastries began filling the settlement, Venjo instructed the Beavers to build a catwalk across the river and a second staircase up the other side of the floodgates dam. And oh no, the very thought of construction on the river caused flooding. The new log pile was instead a sog pile. Seriously though, was there some kind of river spirit or something that the Beavers didn't know about? Like for real, this was kind of weird and random. Maybe the Beavers needed to build another temple to appease the water spirit or something. The Iron Teeth would have welcomed some flooding right about now. It was slow going rebuilding the dam, and until it was finished, a good chunk of their farmland would remain unusable. So Ridgemayar called for a builder's hut so more Beavers could help in the work. Maybe that would get them back on track faster. The irony was they had to pause work on the dam to construct the builder's hut, but then the builder workforce was doubled and the dam would be done in no time. Dead crops were able to be replanted as the water level returned to its previous height. Also, the smelter had been finished and began chugging away, melting scrap metal into metal beams. All things considered, the Iron Teeth had rebounded really well from a pretty serious countermove by the Folktails. Now just to figure out how to get back at those punks. But revenge would have to wait. These Beavers had bigger fish to fry. Well, not fish, and not frying. But now that the dam was fully repaired and the smelter was up and running, the Beavers could finally build what they had been working toward, a food processing factory. Once it was built, this factory would put an end to all their food problems and secure the family's future survival. The Folktails had enough building projects going on already. Venjo was going to town on the downtown remodel, emptying entire warehouses to rearrange the building layout, then tearing them down and making the Beavers clean up the remains of their own hard work. Venjo's plans may have been good, but his aggressive direction was wearing on the family's morale. So the next day, Venjo had an idea, and he secretly began working on a special project. Something that the family would like, something that would make up for the sense of chaos he had caused, something that would win him back some goodwill. something that would honor their past. And secret plans are all well and good, but there was still real work to be done. The Beavers were nearly finished with the relocated and expanded grill/bakery corner, and having crossed the river, they were beginning work on the second staircase. And at the end of the day, the Beavers could always enjoy some time chanting together in the temple, praying for good health and good weather and good harvests. Speaking of harvests, now that the Builder Brigade had finished the stairs, the colony had access to another supply of logs, which would help with the ongoing construction and Venjo's surprise. Progress for the Folktails. It would be a shame if someone came and interrupted that progress. Speaking of interruptions, the Iron Teeth Beavers kept getting injured while working their industry jobs, so they had to build even more medical beds where they could recover. But otherwise, things were going well, especially with the smelter up and running. It was truly remarkable that this small colony had already advanced to metal, as their scavengers gathered it and haulers carried it down the mountain to be turned into metal beams. Soon, the plan for the corn would be realized, and just in time because the field was beginning to sprout. Also just in time because the next drought was already on its way. The Beavers would get one good harvest in before the dry season began, and as the last refined metal beam came hot out of the smelter, the Beavers watched with awe and wonder and bated breath as the food processing factory was finished. This behemoth of an industrial building would take their raw food and turn it into, well, you actually don't want to think too hard about it. You might lose your appetite. But as the first batch of corn was brought in from the farm, the factory churned to life. Literally churned. It was churning the corn in a heated concoction, but doing so multiplied the raw corn into 5 corn rations. The Iron Teeth had basically built a giant popcorn maker, but it was going to feed all their beavers and then some. The days of famine and starvation were behind them, thanks to industrial advancement. With their recent successes, the Iron Teeth started thinking it was time to show those folktales upstream what they were capable of, and finally put them in their place. They didn't have metal or popcorn makers, but the Folktails were still doing just fine. They had cleared the plateau of logs, but that was okay because their oak trees had been growing, and they used those logs to build platforms so they could finish Venjo's secret plan. Venjo had only shared the design with a few builders, but he had hyped it up quite a bit, so everyone was excited to see the finished product. It was more decorative than practical, and the builders were really having to dig into their artistic side to finish the job. The next day, the dry season began. And what perfect timing for Venjo to unveil his surprise. The colony had come a long way under Venjo's leadership. Papa Venjin probably couldn't have even imagined the floodgate dam they'd built, but Venjo didn't want his family to lose sight of those early days, which is why Venjo had secretly been building, and was now finally revealing, a statue of his uncle Venjin. A giant wooden carving of their dear patriarch, positioned right overhead in the midst of their housing development to remind the family of their past and the great leader who started it all. The Beavers were thrilled with the statue. And Venjo earned some extra goodwill with the family too. Good going, Venjo. You're making your family proud. Too bad the Iron Teeth are coming to rain on your parade. That night, the Iron Teeth sent a huge raiding party, and after the Folktales had gone to sleep, the Iron Teeth did the unthinkable. The Folktales awoke as normal and came barreling out of their homes, only to find all the roads were gone. Somehow, the Iron Teeth had torn up the roads themselves. The paths along the river were gone. The paths up the mountain were gone. Thankfully, the downtown platform network was untouched, but basically everywhere else, the roads were just gone. This alarmed the Beavers on multiple levels, because how could you just rip up paths off the ground? What kind of technology could do that? And how did the Iron Teeth have it? Thankfully, paths are a magical thing that can be immediately placed free of charge, so it wasn't long before the settlement started getting back to normal. In fact, it almost felt like this raid wasn't even about hurting the Folktales. It almost felt like some kind of brag by the Iron Teeth, like they just wanted the Folktales to know that they had something the Folktales didn't, and the technology that could allow them to totally remove paths with ease was not something to be taken lightly. How did they do that though? Suddenly, the Folktales weren't feeling quite so confident in their feud. Clearly, the Iron Teeth knew something they didn't know, and that made the Folktales feel exposed. I mean, what material was even strong enough to rip up a road? That was a puzzle to be sure. This was going to take some real thought. Now that is some top-tier psychological warfare, the Iron Teeth thought. How do you make the bigger and stronger enemy afraid of you? You do the impossible, like ripping up their roads. To say the Iron Teeth were proud of themselves would be a massive understatement. For the first time, the Beavers felt like they had the upper hand in this feud. Now they just had to capitalize on it. Don't ask how they were going to do that though. Right now they were taking advantage of the dry season to build more dams. But it would probably involve metal, right? Although with their industry shut down, the smelter wasn't operating, which meant the scrap metal storage soon filled up, which meant the scavengers couldn't keep working anyway. But that is what we call a minor inconvenience. The Beavers had agreed to a Thanksgiving truce, and even arranged to meet along the river for a special holiday feast. The feuding had escalated a lot recently, and the Folktails took the lead in offering a ceasefire so they could share a Thanksgiving meal together with their cousins downriver. The Iron Teeth had accepted, and representatives from each family set up camp and came together in peace. The Iron Teeth suspected that the Folktail clan was scared after the Iron Teeth's latest raid, and were looking to begin peace talks to end the fighting, and acknowledge Ridgemayar as the superior leader. But for now, the two sides came together amicably to enjoy a Thanksgiving feast with each other. They even brought samplings of their different food stocks for the other clan to try out. And in the end, the Beavers had a really nice time eating and talking and not fighting for a change. After their big meal, the Iron Teeth set out for home. It was a long hike through mostly barren land, but the Beavers had made this trip many times before. At least this way they could burn off all the extra food they just ate. But as they came to the canyon that would take them home, they heard an unusual sound. But the Beavers decided to proceed. But it was a trap! The sound they heard was a chain of bombs going off. The Folktails had lined the canyon with explosives. Ridgemayar tried to hurry his family to safety. But Ridgemayar himself was caught in the blast. The fearless leader of the Iron Teeth had fallen. But how did this happen? Well, the Iron Teeth's raid had caught the Folktails off guard, and they felt strongly that they needed to fix that. And the Folktails had plenty of resources to work with to do it. The Folktail leader Venjo had already noticed a problem with their industry. They had run out of room to expand anymore along the river. They had plenty of space along the reservoir, but the water was slow moving and they didn't think it would work for power. They did have a nice flat area right above the temple that they had cleared out, but of course there was no water up there. So how would they generate power? But Venjo already had it worked out like he always did, and shared a design for windmills that would provide power for the Beavers. And once it was all hooked up, it would power a whole new industry area for the colony. That was already a plan in Venjo's mind, but the Iron Teeth's raid gave these Beavers another reason to pursue industry. Because as the Builder Brigade got to work on the windmills, it didn't take long for Venjo to realize it must have been metal from the old ruins that put the Iron Teeth ahead. So he quickly put his Beavers to work harvesting metal as well. The windmills were coming along, and as expected, they generated power just from the breeze passing by. With so many workers in the Folktails family, it wasn't long before the windmill network was completed and the scrap metal was coming in. Venjo plotted a paper mill and a smelter, and if one, why not two? And just like that, the Folktails had entered the Metal Age as well. The windmills would provide more than enough power to the new buildings, and the Builder Brigade would have them constructed in no time. And the smelters would have plenty of fodder to work with, as the Beavers had already harvested lots of scrap metal. They got the paper mill finished and powered. And that's when the Beavers noticed something interesting. The windmills were moving a bit slower today, not producing as much power. Unlike the water wheels, which would produce about the same amount of power as long as the water was flowing, the windmills would fluctuate depending on the wind. Which I guess makes sense when you say it like that, but as long as the buildings were getting power, maybe it would be okay. And it wasn't long before the Builder Brigade had finished the smelter as well, and the process of converting scrap metal to metal beams began, which meant the Beavers would finally be able to build an explosives factory. This building would produce, you guessed it, explosives. And explosives could be placed anywhere. With the Beaver workforce and resources available to them, the Folktails would be on their road to revenge in no time. Of course, not even Venjo could control the wind. Without wind, they had no power. And right now, apparently, there was no wind. So it was a bit of a waiting game for the Beavers. It's not like they didn't have other things going on, but the Folktails had just agreed to a Thanksgiving meetup with the Iron Teeth, and this was supposed to be their surprise retaliation. So, some wind would be nice. Was there like a wind spirit they needed to pray to, or... Because right now the Beavers were just sitting around waiting for the wind. Thank the wind spirit. The smelters were smelting again. Maybe the Folktails would be able to pull this off after all. These guys had busted their beaver tails to get to this point, but the hard work was about to pay off. This building would take their freshly printed paper and turn it into dynamite. somehow. And what could the beavers do with dynamite, you may ask? Well, consider this random bit of land. So annoying the way it just stuck out into the river, but explosives would fix that, because with explosives they could just... voila! No more annoying bit of land. This was a game changer for the Folktales, and exactly what they needed. Sorry for the noise, temple goers. And just in time for their pretend Thanksgiving ceasefire, these beavers were ready to blow the Iron Teeth away. Figuratively speaking. But it wasn't figurative. Ridgemayar had been caught in the blast. The leader of the Iron Teeth was gone. The Iron Teeth were shocked. The Folktales had crossed a line, and the beavers didn't even have time to mourn. They hurried home to tell the family, and to make the Folktales pay. What the Folktales didn't know was that the Iron Teeth had been working on the same thing. They had been increasing their power input and rearranged their industry to include a paper mill. Neither side knew it, but they were both pushing to achieve the same technology. The Folktales had the beaver power and resources to get there quickly, but the Iron Teeth had gotten to metal earlier, so they had a head start. It didn't take long for the mill to be finished and start churning out paper. But what the Iron Teeth lacked, even more than numbers and stocked resources, was science points. Without science, the beavers wouldn't know how to build explosives, even if they had the power and resources to do so. So they were adding more inventors' huts to try and fix that. And they also felt the pressure to man all these extra jobs, so they added more breeding pods. Day by day, the beavers got closer to their goal. The colony was already stretched so thin, but these were some incredibly motivated beavers. If they could just harness the power of explosives, surely that would be enough to put an end to the feud. Of course, it didn't help that beavers kept injuring themselves and needing to use the medical beds to recover, but still, day by day, the beavers got closer to their goal. The settlement had a lot of what they needed. They had plenty of berries growing and plenty more in storage, so the breeding pods could keep spitting out, babies. They had plenty of food and water. They had their plan to use this new technology against the Folktales. They had the element of surprise, or so they thought. The one thing they didn't have was the science, so they kept building more inventors' huts. They would get there eventually, but the Iron Teeth really wanted to get there now. Although they had just been invited by the Folktales to a Thanksgiving truce, so maybe they had more time than they thought. But thanks to the extra inventors' huts, the beavers were ready to begin construction on their explosives factory. They still had to rush if they wanted to get it finished before the Thanksgiving feast, though. The Iron Teeth weren't sure what to make of the Folktales' invitation, but they wanted to be prepared, whatever the outcome of the meetup. Though they certainly weren't prepared for... And now, Ridgemayar was gone, the explosives factory was built, it was the dry season, and the Iron Teeth were here to take their revenge. And just like that, the dam was gone. Within seconds, the water from the reservoir came pouring out on the Folktales. A massive wave came sweeping through the settlement, soaking their land and flooding their buildings. The Folktales watched helplessly as the water rolled in, creating a giant beaver bath. But this bath was going to do worse than just clean behind their beaver ears. The water ruined their crops so the beavers couldn't work their farms, and flooded their huts and homes so the beavers couldn't work their jobs. Minutes later, the whole ground floor of the settlement was ankle deep in water, and the reservoir wasn't even emptied yet. Their massive reserve, which was such a monumental accomplishment, had now totally flooded their home. The Iron Teeth had hit back and hit back hard. This amount of flooding was a crippling blow to the Folktales. The upper levels of the settlement were still dry and operational, including the new industrial zone, but the beavers were literally swimming on the ground level. Thankfully, no one was hurt or swept away in the flood, but the beavers were now in quite the pickle. Too much water had never been the problem before now, and the beavers weren't quite sure how to fix this. But if they didn't fix it, their whole settlement was done for. Not to mention they would have to admit defeat to the Iron Teeth. And that was never going to happen. Meanwhile, the Iron Teeth were ecstatic about their hugely successful raid. They felt strongly that they had avenged the death of Ridgemayar and put the Folktales in their place. And they went back to work the next morning with newfound joy. Joy like a mama beaver holding her newborn kit. Except that the Iron Teeth didn't even really know what that felt like because they used these disgusting breeding pods. Gross. Also, it was still the dry season, so none of their industry was running because the river wasn't turning their water wheels. But still, they had totally flooded the Folktales and ruined their day, and that brought them joy. And amidst the celebration, the Iron Teeth felt like they finally had a chance to mourn the loss of their leader Ridgemayar and honor his memory. Ridgemayar, who had led their colony in strength since the death of Quigamit, who had stood up to the treacherous Folktales. They hoped Ridgemayar would have been proud of how they had avenged him. The Iron Teeth's raid had definitely done some damage to the Folktails colony. The beavers were soaked from the moment they woke up. All beavers enjoyed getting their fur wet, but this was just too much. And wet fur was the least of the problems this flood was causing, because half the Folktail buildings were completely inoperable. The few industries unaffected were the grills and bakeries, the scientist huts, and the windmill industrial sector, which conveniently included the explosives factory. But also their crops were drowned and dead, and their trees weren't far behind. The only farm that wasn't flooded was the new tree farm on the hill, though ironically half those trees were now dying from lack of water. So not only was half the colony suddenly unemployed, they weren't bringing in any new food or water. Luckily, they had built up quite a decent stockpile of both, enough to keep the family alive while they waited for the floodwaters to evaporate, which didn't sound like much of a plan, but so far it was the only one the Folktails had. Ration the supplies, pray to whatever spirit might make the evaporation happen faster, and maybe, just maybe, plot revenge on the Iron Teeth for what they had done. Now that the dust had settled, it was time for the Iron Teeth to decide on a new leader. The beaver Rozzy put himself forward, but unlike last time, another beaver challenged him, a hauler named Malik. So now the Iron Teeth had to come up with a trial that would determine who their next leader would be. And by the next day, their plan was ready. The two challengers would race, both on foot and through water, and the winner of the race would be named leader of the family. The beavers chose a starting line and endpoint, and Rozzy and Malik agreed to the terms. And when the horn blew, the competitors were off in a flash. Rozzy had taken an early lead, but could he keep it? Malik was young and hungry. This was anyone's race. They dove into the water, Malik right behind Rozzy. The Iron Teeth would accept the results of the trial, whatever the outcome, but truthfully everyone wanted Rozzy to win. And as they rounded the last turn, Rozzy arrived at the finish line first. Rozzy was declared the new leader of the colony, and Malik was shamed for his failure. The Iron Teeth were excited to move forward under Rozzy's leadership. Meanwhile, the Folktails had wet feet from the moment they woke up, and that was not something to be excited about. But more importantly, they had discovered one more problem caused by the flooding. A number of their houses were now uninhabitable, leaving some beavers without a bed to sleep in. And with everything else these beavers had been through, that was simply unacceptable. So Venjo began plotting a new housing section up the hill. It was a big undertaking, but Venjo wasn't going to leave his family sleeping outdoors in a giant puddle. And seeing as nobody had any ideas to get rid of the water, new construction on dry ground was the only option. Of course, the beavers also needed to start repairing the dam, and there were plenty of unemployed beavers at the moment, so Venjo prioritized a new builder hut that would get the builder brigade back to full strength and get to work on these new houses. And the Iron Teeth were also getting to work on some new housing. These new barracks were even larger, and unlike the Folktails, the Iron Teeth had a full builder brigade ready to roll in and get to work. And their farms were doing well, and everyone was staying fed, and the metal scavenging was going well, and they had a big stockpile. But it was still the dry season, which meant their industry section was completely shut down. The water would return soon, so it didn't really matter. But the beavers started thinking about how they might prevent that dry season slowdown. Not only did they have to wait through the droughts, but because of how many dams they had built, when the water did come back, it took an entire day before the river would get the wheels turning again. And the Iron Teeth wondered if there wasn't some alternative solution that would keep their industry running more consistently. So they started with some dynamite, which is a very good place to start. And after a bit of building and a couple of booms, the beavers had kinda maybe an idea for moving forward. Unfortunately, they also had a lot of beavers injuring themselves on the job, so their construction plans got slightly derailed. But they had plenty of time before the next dry season. Venjo had an idea. He had found a spot where another water pump could go, on dry ground and able to function normally. But this pump wasn't about providing drinking water for the beavers. This pump was an attempt to drain the flood water faster. They weren't sure it would work, but it's not like it could make it worse. And by the end of the day, they had a water pump going, aiding the evaporation process. It was still going to be a long road, though. The builders were making progress on the new housing district, so even if the pump didn't help, the beavers wouldn't be sleeping outside anymore. And whether the flooding cleared up or not, the dry season would be over soon, and even more water would be heading their way. So the Folktails really needed to get busy rebuilding the dam. And since the explosives factory wasn't one of the buildings that got flooded, they had the tools they needed to rebuild it even better, and the tools they needed to get back at the Iron Teeth. And it was high time they got back at the Iron Teeth. While the Iron Teeth slept, the Folktails delivered their surprise. A crap ton of explosives, laid out in a chain that would completely cut off the barracks from the rest of the settlement. The Iron Teeth were startled from sleep by the thunderous sound of dynamite ripping apart the landscape. and water pouring through the channel that now separated them from everything they had built. But in their hurry to devastate the Iron Teeth, the Folktails missed an important detail, because the Iron Teeth had already pathed across the river and had a long way around back to their settlement. So the new channel was a nuisance, but definitely not the devastating blow the Folktails hoped it would be. But there was an unexpected outcome from the raid, because water began flowing through the channel, turning what was cracked and dry ground into green, usable land. So, the Beavers decided to build a dam at the end of the channel and build platforms over the rest of it, but keep the water flowing underneath. That way it wouldn't drain the river, but it would keep the land green. So it would take some construction, but the Iron Teeth were going to come out of this even better off than they were before. Speaking of coming out better than before, the reconstruction of the Floodgate Dam was underway, and wouldn't you know, but all of a sudden, the land finally dried up. At last, the floodwaters had receded, and the land was usable again. The Beavers had survived, and things could get back to normal. What a rough few days. And thank goodness the Folktails had such a stockpile of food and water to see them through it. That night, the Beavers gave thanks like they hadn't in a long time. The Folktails had overcome their biggest challenge yet. Of course, now was not the time to slow down. The Beavers had chewed through much of their food supply and needed to replant their farms quickly, and the dry season was nearly over. It was now imperative that the Folktails rebuild the dam, or risk the river flooding them again. And that was the last thing these Beavers wanted. So the Builder Brigade put everything they had into the reconstruction, and as the water returned, the builders were wrapping up the retaining wall and beginning on the floodgates. So they didn't get the whole dam finished in time, but the retaining wall should be enough for now. And with so many Beavers in the brigade, the floodgates would be up in no time, which would refill their reservoir and prevent any flooding. What a hustle by the Folktails. The Iron Teeth were working on covering their new canal, but even with the dam in place, they had a water flow problem. So even though they were cleaning up their paths, the riverbank was still a mess. The Beavers would need to use some more dynamite to solve this problem. They might need more dynamite to solve their Folktails problem too, but that would have to wait as they had other matters to attend to. Because the Folktails raid inadvertently opened up a whole world of possibilities. First, they had to channel this water by extending the channel further, so it flowed back into the river. But if the Beavers could harness the flow of water, that would be a game changer. The Folktails had watered their ground accidentally. The Iron Teeth wondered if they could do it again, intentionally. Dig their own channel to irrigate the land. That's pretty advanced stuff for Beavers. But first, the Iron Teeth wanted to address and solve another problem. Industry was important to the Iron Teeth, and they wanted to keep their factories going even during the droughts. But they had run out of space, so they had to get creative with expanding their power network. They built platforms so they could run their power line over the path, and then had space to build new engines. These engines would burn logs to produce power even when the water was not flowing, so their industries could remain operational. This was another big advancement for the Iron Teeth, and their settlement was really coming along. The Folktails Builder Brigade was still hustling to finish the Floodgate Dam, and already the river was beginning to back up because of the restricted flow. And epic build montage. The floodgates were done, all in a day's work. And then all of a sudden the river started flooding again. Inconceivable! Finish the floodgates and it starts flooding? That doesn't make any sense. Was the river spirit trying to give these beavers PTSD? They just got their lands back. Luckily, this flood sorted itself out overnight. But then the next morning, wouldn't you know it, but it flooded again. The floodgates were supposed to prevent flooding. What the heck was going on? The Builder Brigade still had to finish the inside retaining wall, so maybe that would solve the problem. Nope. For some reason, the Folktails just couldn't escape the flooding. All they had wanted was for the ground under their feet to stay dry. But apparently that was too much to ask. They had this new and improved dam, which looked awesome by the way. You'd think that would be problem solved. But you would think wrong, because the floods kept coming. No flooding at the Iron Teeth settlement, of course, but they had finished the first engine, and once they loaded it with logs, it came roaring to life, adding its power to the network. The Beavers had found their solution to the dry season slowdown, so now they could focus their attention on digging another irrigation channel. They laid out a long chain of dynamite, just like the Folktails had done, so they could bring water to what was now dry ground. And once the explosives were set, they set them off and watched the fireworks. Watched the water flow in and the green land appear. And just like that, the Iron Teeth had worked out their own irrigation system. All that was left was to cover the channel and turn it back into a road. Those clever Iron Teeth were sure making some big advances. At this point, they weren't even mad at the Folktails anymore. Not that everything was suddenly good between them or anything, just that these beavers weren't itching to get revenge, because they were growing more stable by the day. And at this point, they thought nothing would be able to bring them down. But they thought wrong. The Folktails were building a bridge across their new dam, and still dealing with intermittent flooding. They even tried excavating the riverbank in an attempt to increase the size of the basin at the bottom of the dam. But the river was still not happy with them for some reason. Maybe if they just focused on something else for a while. So they expanded their housing, they experimented with new suspension bridges, which could span gaps without needing support underneath. That could be a game changer for beavers living in a canyon. They also tried out a new kind of storage pile that was underground. Unconventional, but it could store a ton more logs. And wouldn't you know, but the river hadn't flooded in a couple days. Maybe the river spirit was just tired of the attention. The beavers were quite proud of their new housing district, but wanted to improve the landscaping. And a water pump out back would be a real improvement. A few logs later, and the pump was up and running. A beaver named Katanja took the position, and once haulers delivered the water, the whole area came alive. First the dam, now an artificial lake. The Folktails were proving themselves to be irrigation masters as well. They knew a drought was coming any day now, but with the floodgate dam completed and working, and the reservoir all filled up, the Folktails expected this dry season to be a breeze. And they were absolutely not expecting what was headed their way. Because rather than a drought, something bad was coming downriver toward the Folktails settlement. A red tide was flowing into the region, polluting the reservoir. This nasty and toxic sludge was totally taking over and having an immediate and terrible effect on the land and plants. As the bad tide reached the dam, the beavers realized they may have a big problem on their paws. And to add insult to injury, the river was flooding again. But this time flooding a mixture of water and the toxic tide. The river was turning as the bad water continued to flow, and the stream that had brought life to the colony was now poisoning it and killing it. In just a day's time, the river was turned red, and the plants were all dead. This was a problem. It was also a problem for the Iron Teeth, as the bad tide came rushing into their colony as well, poisoning their water and their land, and killing everything it touched. It didn't help that the Iron Teeth had just built irrigation channels through the interior of their settlement, speeding up the spread of the toxic sludge. It was just hours before every drop of water had turned red, except for the water in storage. Oh, and it started flooding too. The Iron Teeth were getting a taste of what the Folktails had been dealing with, just a lot worse because this flood was poison. And by the time the flooding subsided, it didn't matter, because everything was already ruined, and the beavers were in a pickle. Will this bad tide end? And how long before it does? If it does, what will the beavers be able to recover? And how long will that take? And was it worth the risk to wait and see? The Folktails were wrestling with the same questions. This wasn't just a drought, this was a new danger. Not only were they unprepared, they didn't even know if it was possible to prepare, or if their colony could even survive in these conditions. They had built so much here, but this settlement could be doomed. They just didn't know. They couldn't know. So that night, when the beavers gathered, Venjo made a crucial decision for the family. The beavers would have to leave their home or risk extinction. They gathered the family together, and together set out to find a new, and hopefully safer, land. The Iron Teeth had come to the same conclusion. This land may never recover, so the family gathered and embarked on an exodus to find a new home, away from the bad tide. Hey everyone, Lieutenant Dan here. Thanks for watching this Part 1 Supercut of Beaver Tales. This series was a lot of fun to make, and I hope you're enjoying it. You'll be able to follow the rest of the story of these beavers in the Part 2 Supercut coming soon. Thanks again for watching. I hope you stick around and check out the other fun stuff happening here at Lieutenant Dan Productions. You guys have a fantastic day.